we're looking at supranational, or you can't talk about supranationalism without kind of revisiting sovereignty. The power of a country to rule itself without interference from the outside. Historically, this has been defined, as we talked about in December, by the military power to defend one's borders. And I showed y'all a map last time about the Roman Empire, and you've got the frontier zone towards the northern part of the empire that they just couldn't defend past a certain point. And so that was the definition of their borders. It was measured by their ability to defend it militarily. Now, on top of that, when you're studying European history, one of the things that kind of characterize, I would say, everything from the Middle Ages up to modern times, more or less, definitely the 1900s, you've got this concept of the balance of power, all right? Europe didn't like it. As a whole, they didn't like it collectively whenever one single country gained so much strength and power that they were able to dominate other countries, or all other countries. The reasons that they didn't like this boils down to, well, you can definitely see it surmised in Napoleon and Hitler. Okay, Napoleon started a conquest of Europe. Everyone, in some form or fashion in Europe, every European country either were allies with Napoleon, either were conquered and their kingdoms deposed by Napoleon, such as Spain, or they were forced allies or in some kind of forced allegiance to Napoleon, like Austria and Russia. All right. So everyone in Europe, except for the United Kingdom, except for Great Britain, were under the control of Napoleon in the early 1800s. That's what happens when the balance of power goes totally wrong and there is no balance of power. So again and again throughout history, you see where Europe tries to maintain this at any and all costs. And Hitler is another example. Hitler started to take lands in order to have more living space. Lebensraum is the German word for that. And so in order to combat powerful foes, countries would oftentimes form coalitions and alliances. So again, looking at Europe, if it looked like any one single country like France or Napoleon was going to get so strong that they would control that balance, or that they would single-handedly control all of Europe, then the other countries would form coalitions, basically alliances against them. All right, and so it didn't matter if the allied countries were culturally or politically the same. What I mean by this is if you look at the 30 Years' War, which actually happened prior to Napoleon, this was in the 1600s. You've got a war where it lasted 30 years. So I mean, the motivations for the war change over time, but initially it was all about religion, kind of on a local level within Germany. Okay, but eventually the French, who were predominantly Catholic, ended up siding with Protestants in this dispute because it ended up being about politics and about that balance of power. And so they would rather help Protestants than to allow one single country to dominate in Europe and have that balance of power tilt in their favor. So that was the 30 Years' War example. Napoleonic Wars, once again, Austria, even though they were allies with Napoleon, even though Napoleon married the Austrian Archduchess, he still sided with the allies against Napoleon once Napoleon started to fall after the Russian campaign. And yeah, another example is World War II. Stalin, we're going to talk about in a second. He didn't like the United States. He allied with us, the West, in order to stop Hitler, because we collectively disliked Hitler more than we disliked each other at the time. But things are going to change in the 1900s. All right. League of Nations. Okay. So when I say things are going to change, the 1900s brought with it a lot of militarily, our technology from a military standpoint was insane, but also because of our increased interconnectedness with one another after, in particular, World War II, we're going to start seeing changes in the way that we handle our relationships with one another. All right. So in the beginning of the 1900s, you've got the Great War, World War I. One of the things that kind of came out of that war was the invention of the League of Nations. Now, Woodrow Wilson was our genius PhD president at the time, and he kind of came up with this idea, or this series of ideas called the 14 Points Plan, which is kind of the way that we went about handling peace after World War I. And the 14th point was to create a League of Nations. All right. And the purpose of this is to essentially promote world peace. I have it here somewhere. Preserving a permanent peace. Okay. We wanted to make sure, quite unlike we have ever been able to do historically, that another war of the magnitude of the Great War would never occur again. Now, the ultimate irony here is that the way that we ended World War I largely led to the Second Great War, World War II. But this is the purpose of the League of Nations. It is the first example of supranationalism that we're going to see in the world. And yeah, you could argue that even going back as far as the Greeks, they might have had supranationalism when you have like the Delian League, for example. Athens kind of headed up this allegiance of city-states in Greece in order to fight against the Persians. So you can argue that supranationalism maybe was a Greek thing, but if we're looking at the modern world or anything close to it, the League of Nations is the first supranational organization. Unfortunately, another irony having to do with this League of Nations is that even though it was created and proposed and presented by Woodrow Wilson, it was his big pet project, the United States never joined because he couldn't just unilaterally decide, hey, the U.S. is going to be part of the League of Nations, guys. I don't care if you don't like it, Congress. That's what we're going to do. No, it didn't work like that. And Congress actually was still very isolationist. The last thing we wanted to do was join an alliance, more or less, with the rest of the world that would require us to bend at the expense of other countries. And we didn't want to get ourselves involved in all of that. And so, once again, looking at that whole sovereignty mentality. So, so that's the issue with. I should have gone. I didn't go to the slide in time. That's the issue with the League of Nations. Even though maybe it was a good idea in concept, in practice, it really was a giant failure. The League of Nations really didn't have a whole lot of power. It would offer suggestions and ideas, but ultimately countries had to come together and agree that they were going to abide by those things. And eventually, prior to World War II, Germany, Japan, they back out of the League of Nations, and we find ourselves once again at exactly where we were prior to, and that is trying to figure out how we're going to win this gigantic modern war.